Hey there, it's Dr. Mike T. Nelson here. Wanted to do a video for you on metabolic flexibility and what sports supplements to consider enhancing performance. And the outline that we're using here again is the concept of metabolic flexibility. And as you know, if we draw out the spectrum, which is based on MedFlex bioenergetics, on the way far right hand for ultimate speed and power, we have the ATP PC system. And if we go back to what are the two main fuels for metabolic flexibility, on the left hand side we've got fat, and on the right hand side we have carbohydrates. And as you know, metabolic flexibility is how well can you use carbohydrates, how well can you use fat, and how well can you switch back and forth between the both of those. And when we look, we can also add in some subsets. So the ATP PC system is used for very high power, so very short. Now granted, all these energy systems turn on at the same time. It's just a difference of the rate at which they can supply the ultimate currency of energy, which is ATP. So ATP PC system can supply that in relatively short order, but it doesn't last long. We don't really have a lot of stored ATP. Even with this system, we can't get it sustained for a long period of time. If we go down the spectrum a little bit and use carbohydrates, mainly through a process called glycolysis, we can get pretty high levels of power, not quite as high as the ATP PC, and we can get them for a longer period of time. And when we run the carbohydrate end of the spectrum pretty hard for a while, one of the byproducts is going to be lactate. So you're probably familiar with doing a lactate testing. You can use handheld monitors to get levels of lactate. The downside when you produce a lot of lactate is you also produce a lot of hydrogen ions. And these hydrogen ions are literally an acid, right? They're free hydrogen molecules. So when we run glycolysis a lot, we use a lot of carbohydrates through the system. We're trying to get some sustained speed and power, some higher intensity work. The byproducts there are going to be lactate and hydrogen ions. Now the lactate actually is used as a fuel. It can be used by other working muscles, kind of muscles that are not working as hard. The cardiac system can use lactate, and even your brain can use lactate. So now the purpose of this video is what are some sports supplements that may slightly enhance performance. And by performance here, we're talking, small percentages, single digits, 1 to maybe 9%. But at an elite level, that makes a huge difference by just consuming different supplements. And we'll get to fat in this talk also. So on the right hand of the spectrum, our ATP PC system, the main supplement that can help with that end is good old-fashioned creatine. Creatine's been around for a long time, and you just need the boring old creatine monohydrate. Don't need any of the fancy versions. So far to date, out of the hundreds of studies that have been done on creatine monohydrate, there hasn't been any other form that has been shown to be superior. Some forms may be equivalent, but to me it's not even an issue to even mess around with. In general, you're going to want about 5 grams per day. If you're a very large athlete, maybe go up to 10 grams per day. That's a little bit theoretical. If you have a very short period of time, you can do a loading phase, which is 20 grams for maybe 7 to 14 days. However, if you've got a 30-day time point, whether you do a loading phase or just around 5 to 10 grams per day, for 30 days, you're going to end up at the same amount. So I tend to use, for most athletes, around 5 grams per day. Again, if you're a very large athlete, maybe go up to 10 grams per day. That's more theoretical, and we know that there's very few downsides of creatine monohydrate. Probably the most studied sports supplement ever. There's hundreds of studies on it. So 5 grams per day. After around 30 days, you're going to be saturated at the muscle level of creatine. Not a lot of data to support that you need high amounts of carbohydrates or really need to take anything else with it. So creatine monohydrate, super good. Also, if you're participating in a sport where you may get hit in the head or you have a risk of concussion, while the data mostly is in animals, there is some interesting data that creatine may reduce your risk of having some brain issues or traumatic brain injury. Yeah, that data is still a little bit theoretical. It's mostly animal work. That's also one of the reasons for a lot of athletes I recommend potentially higher doses of creatine for that. So number one, on the high end of the spectrum, we have creatine monohydrate. As we move down, we can maybe look at something that could buffer some of these hydrogen ions from producing a lot of energy from carbohydrates, running glycolysis. The byproducts are lactate, which is used as a fuel, and then hydrogen ions. So hydrogen ions are literally an acid that can muck up the actin and myosin cross-bridging. So the actual physical muscle contraction itself. So the main supplement for that is one you're probably familiar with, is BetaAlanine. So BetaAlanine forms in the body. You combine it with L-histamine, histine, and you get intramuscular carnosine. If you can read that. It's hard to read. So intramuscular carnosine is what actually gets bumped up, and intramuscular carnosine is a really good buffer for those pesky hydrogen ions. What dose of beta-alanine are you looking at? I think the dose is probably going to be higher than what people realize. I'm still a big fan of around 6 to 9 grams per day. Now, I agree that if you look in the current literature, most of it you're going to see is around 3 grams per day. And I think that's a fair place to start. Again, we've seen a fair amount of studies on the beta-alanine. The results generally positive, although that's sometimes controversial. The key with it is if you're doing a sport where your max output is around 30 to 120, maybe 240 seconds, that's going to be kind of the sweet spot for beta-alanine to potentially be effective. Reason for that is because you're running a lot of carbohydrates, you're burning through a lot of glycogen in the form of carbohydrates, producing a lot of lactate, and producing a lot of hydrogen ions. If your sport is lasting 30 to 60 to 90 minutes, you're just not at a high enough intensity that it's probably going to make any difference. Again, dosing there, 3 grams is what's been kind of shown in the literature. My bias is I think we're going to find future studies 6 to 9 grams is going to be a little bit better. Now that's per day. So sometimes you may get this itchy kind of sensation. It's not bad, quote unquote, it's not really a negative, but it does feel pretty weird. And unfortunately, to get around that, you have to reduce the acute dose. For myself, if I take anything more than about 1.5 grams of beta-alanine at once, I get that weird itchy feeling. And it really just kind of bothers me. But at 1.5 grams per day times 4, I'd have to dose it 4 times per day to just get to the 6 gram amount. So that's the downside with beta-alanine, is if you get really itchy from it, you have to reduce the dose, and then you have to take it more frequently. Loading phase, again, highly debatable, but 4 to 8 weeks I think is kind of a min. Dr. Roger Harris has done some work showing that intramuscular carnosine levels are still going up on high doses of beta-alanine many months after taking it. Now again, we don't know exactly how much intramuscular carnosine results in changes in performance, but we do know that the ceiling, I think, is going to be higher than what we realize for beta-alanine. most athletes I've worked with are probably underdosing it. And it's relatively inexpensive right now. Again, other than the temporary itchy feeling, not too many side effects that we've seen so far. On the fat end of the spectrum, we could maybe talk about ketones are a byproduct of running through a ton of fat through the system with low levels of insulin. I don't think they're really going to be that beneficial for all-out performance unless you get into some really crazy ultra endurance events where you have to carry all your own food and everything. So in terms of beneficial, we can get them now as a salt. We can also get them in an ester form. There's other studies, such as a study by Cox, that combine them with carbohydrates and did see a performance boost in elite cyclists. So I think maybe, I would say right now, the jury is still out on that. I do think that they may have reduced risk, potentially for TBI, if you're in a sport where you may suffer some head trauma or head injury. Team Sky has reported using them in different things like the Tour de France. And again, that may be just to potentially reduce the risk of TBI in cyclists if they had some type of an accident. There's some studies looking at ketones related to cognition under high levels of exercise. And again, that one's a big maybe. Might be beneficial. I'd say the jury is still out on that. And at a high level, even something like a marathon, people generally would think that's a lot of fat. And actually, if you're at a very elite level, it's mostly carbohydrates that you're actually using. So fat doesn't get used as much of a fuel for most elite level performance. Health is going to be a different question altogether. So different things that may increase something called MFO, maximal fat oxidation. Most of them, I would say, at least the supplements, are kind of hit or miss. One that may potentially work, which everyone's familiar with, is caffeine. Caffeine may increase the amount of free fatty acids. That's been highly debatable. It does increase the release of them into the bloodstream more. Does that actually help performance? Probably not. However, caffeine does interact on the adenosine receptors, and that can increase performance via effects in the central nervous system. Again, what amounts of caffeine are you talking about? Pretty high doses for strength and power, 6 to 9 milligrams per kg. And endurance maybe starts as low as 3 milligrams per kg. So if you're a 100 kg athlete and you're at a 6 mg per kg dose, that's 600 milligrams of caffeine. That's a pretty stout dose. If you do tend to use caffeine, obviously make sure you read the rules. Most of the time it's not necessarily a banned substance anymore, even at high levels. If your levels get too high in caffeine, you'll actually see your performance go down. Now you can have what's called an ergolytic effect, meaning that your performance will then drop. So I tell people start on the very low end of the spectrum. Definitely use it in practice and see how you feel and perform. And you probably want to use some type of tablet or pill form. If you're using it in the form of coffee, it can vary widely in the amount of caffeine, even with the same brewing method. You can look up a study from McCusker on that. So those are some of the main sports supplements. I know this slide got like super messy, super hard to see anything. But if we review, we've got ATP, PC. The main one for that is going to be our friend, creatine monohydrate, about 5 grams per day, maybe 10 grams per day. If we're running through a lot of carbohydrates, we're producing lactate and hydrogen ions. The main thing that can potentially buffer hydrogen ions is beta-alanine. Beta-alanine dosage, you're looking at about 6 to 9 grams per day. There is some other data on things like good old-fashioned baking soda or bicarbonate. The data is pretty mixed on that, I would say. Some people see a benefit from it. Personally, with athletes, I haven't seen a huge benefit. and you can run the risk of having some GI issues with that too. So I'd say that one is a maybe. So beta-alanine is an intramuscular buffer. Things that like bicarbonate are a blood buffer. So in theory they should work together, although I'd say the jury on bicarbonate still pretty mixed, and I find in practice athletes don't like any GI upset. If the GI issues don't bother them, potentially that could be something that could help buffer some of those hydrogen ions. In terms of fat, byproduct of fat is some ketones. Ketones can be supplemented now in two different forms. There's a salt version, which is bonded to different ions, and there's an ester version. The ester version will get ketones much, much higher. Again, for all-out performance, I don't really think that's going to be a huge advantage. For other potential risks, such as reduction of risk in TBI or helping some pathologies after they've been developed for health reasons, I think they're very interesting. Potentially for cognition during longer events, I would say that's maybe. The data on that is mixed, although some of it is a little bit positive. You can look up some studies from Dr. Dom D'Agostino. Dr. Brandon Egan would be the go-to ones on that. Caffeine is a very well-known ergogenic agent. It's been used for a long time. The main effects are going to be on the central nervous system through the adenosine receptors. It does increase free fatty acids in the blood a little bit. I don't think that's really going to be ergogenic or performance enhancement though. If you're using caffeine, high dose for strength and power, about 6 to 9 milligrams per kg. Endurance, probably lower, start around 3 milligrams per kg and work your way up from there. There's some other data showing that it may help reduce pain potentially too at higher doses, so that may be another mechanism. So those are some basic, easy to find sports supplements that have ergogenic properties. Again, like all things, make sure you read the rules, that you're not in violation of any of them. Most of these are generally not banned, pretty common, and have a lot of supportive data behind them. Thank you so much.